I was 5 when my world crumbled, covered in dust, alone, wandering streets where heroes and strangers alike just walked past. Sound familiar? It's the moment Shigaraki was born, not from his quirk, but from a society that forgot how to care. In the next few minutes, I'm diving into why My Hero Academia needed Shigaraki to expose its darkest flaws, and why his story hits closer to home than you might think. Stick around, because by the end, you'll see how this broken system didn't just create a villain, it guaranteed one.
また英雄ごっこか。
太郎さんやめて。乱暴はやめて。
明確な殺意を持って父に触れた。誰でもいいから。
僕？大丈夫。すぐヒーローか警察かだね。
それでも家族を殺したあの時もし。
Part 1. The Bystander Effect on a Societal Scale. The most haunting aspect of Shigaraki's origin story isn't the moment his quirk manifested and accidentally killed his family, it's what happened afterward. A 5-year-old child, covered in the dust of his loved ones, wandered the streets for what felt like an eternity, while heroes and civilians alike passed him by. This wasn't a case of a single person's indifference. It was an entire society's failure to see suffering right in front of them. Much like how Gon Freaks in Hunter x Hunter was abandoned by his father to pursue his own ambitions, Shigaraki was abandoned not by one person, but by an entire civilization that had forgotten its basic humanity. Envision a small figure stumbling through crowded sidewalks, his hollow eyes searching for someone, anyone, who might notice his pain. The camera would linger on the faces of passers-by, each one turning away with practiced ease, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and willful ignorance. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was something far more insidious, a learned behavior that had infected an entire civilization. The hero system, for all its show and public adoration, created a peculiar form of learned helplessness among ordinary citizens. When everyone assumes someone else will handle the crisis, when helping others becomes the exclusive domain of licensed professionals, society develops blind spots large enough for a traumatized child to fall through. Having witnessed similar systemic failures in our own world, where people record violence instead of intervening or assume someone else will call for help, Shigaraki's abandonment feels disturbingly plausible. The same pedestrians who would cheer for All Might on television couldn't bring themselves to offer comfort to a clearly distressed child on their own street. What makes this even more disturbing is how normalized this indifference had become. Think about how many times we see crowds in My Hero Academia simply watching disasters unfold, holding up their phones to record rather than acting. They've been conditioned to believe that intervention is not their place. That's what heroes are for. But heroes can't be everywhere at once. And in those gaps between professional responses, human decency is supposed to fill the void. This systematic indifference reveals something profound about how hero society functions. The professional hero system didn't just create a class of superpowered protectors, it fundamentally rewrote the social contract about who bears responsibility for others' welfare. Citizens became spectators in their own communities, trained to consume heroism rather than practice it. The infrastructure meant to protect society unintentionally created the very conditions that would produce its greatest threats. Every time someone walked past a child in need, because a hero will handle it, they were contributing to a system that valued specialization over compassion. The same society that celebrated All Might's victories couldn't recognize that true heroism often happens in small, uncostumed moments of human connection. What's particularly tragic is how this mirrors real-world psychological phenomena. The bystander effect doesn't just occur in individual emergencies, it scales up to entire social systems. When helping others becomes professionalized, when we delegate our moral responsibilities to specialists, we don't just lose our capacity to act, we lose our ability to see the need for action in the first place. The crowd mentality that allowed everyone to ignore Shigaraki wasn't malicious, it was the logical outcome of a society that had systematically removed individual agency from the equation. Even more damning is how the hero ranking system reinforced this dynamic. Heroes were valued not for their compassion or their ability to prevent suffering, but for their spectacle and efficiency in combat. The metrics that determine success, villain defeats, property damage minimized, public approval ratings, never included how many traumatized children were comforted or How many potential villains were saved through simple human kindness? The hero system created clear divisions between those who act and those who observe, with devastating consequences for anyone who fell between the cracks. The cruel irony is that All for One understood this vulnerability better than any hero did. He didn't just recruit Shigaraki, he was the only one who offered the abandoned child what society had failed to provide: acknowledgement of his existence, validation of his pain, and a sense of belonging. The greatest villain in the series succeeded not through overwhelming power, but by simply being present when everyone else chose to look away. This wasn't an accident or oversight in the hero system. It was an inevitable result of how it was structured. When you create a society where helping others requires a license, where intervention is the exclusive domain of professionals, you don't just limit who can act heroically, you actively discourage ordinary people from recognizing their own moral agency. The bystander effect becomes institutionalized, codified into law and social expectation. This systematic dehumanization reminds me of how we've normalized walking past homeless individuals or scrolling past fundraisers for suffering people. We've become experts at justifying our indifference. Shigaraki's tragedy began not with his destructive quirk, but with a society that had outsourced its humanity to people in costumes.
Finally! He's been the temporary number one, but he'll officially inherit that sacred spot! Flame Hero Endeavor!
Since this child decided to fan the flames, I won't say much. So instead, just watch what I do.
Part 2. The Cult of Heroic Perfection. Imagine a world where heroes stride across billboards and television screens, their smiles as polished as their costumes, their reputations more valuable than gold. Hero Society's obsession with maintaining flawless public images created an environment where acknowledging systemic failures became impossible. Heroes weren't just protectors, they were brands, symbols, and aspirational figures who couldn't afford to admit that some problems couldn't be punched into submission. This cult of heroic perfection meant that the messy, complicated work of actually healing societal wounds was consistently overlooked in favor of flashy rescues and villain defeats. But here's where the narrative takes a darker turn. Much like how the Survey Corps in Attack on Titan discovered that their greatest enemy wasn't the Titans they'd been fighting, but the very system that created those Titans in the first place. Hero Society was blind to its own role in manufacturing the very evil it claimed to combat. The heroes were so busy basking in the spotlight of their victories that they never bothered to examine the shadows they cast, shadows where children like Tenko Shimura were left to rot, forgotten and abandoned. The tragedy here runs deeper than simple negligence. When a society builds its entire moral framework around the idea that certain people are inherently heroic while others are inherently villainous, it loses the ability to recognize that victims and perpetrators aren't mutually exclusive categories. Shigaraki embodied this contradiction. A victim whose victimization transformed him into a perpetrator, creating a cycle that the black and white morality of Hero Society couldn't comprehend, let alone address. This wasn't philosophy, it was the harsh reality of a system that created its own monsters through willful ignorance. Personally, I think this is the part of the story that hurts the most, realizing that the system doesn't just fail people, it shapes them into the very thing it claims to fight. What makes this even more devastating is how this binary thinking extended beyond individual heroes to the institutions themselves. The Hero Commission and hero schools focused exclusively on training people to fight existing threats, rather than preventing those threats from emerging in the first place. It's a purely reactive system, masquerading as a proactive one, always ready to battle the monster, but never asking why monsters keep appearing in the first place. They were like doctors who specialized in treating gunshot wounds, but refused to acknowledge the existence of guns. The personal cost of this system becomes clear when you realize that every hero who bought into this mythology, from All Might to Endeavor, became complicit in perpetuating it. All Might, for all his genuine desire to help, became the ultimate symbol of this flawed ideology. His very existence as the symbol of peace reinforced the idea that society could rely on individual heroics rather than collective responsibility. When he finally fell, the cracks in the system became impossible to hide. Or think of Endeavor, whose single-minded pursuit of the number one spot led him to abuse his family, creating the very villain, Dabi, he would later have to face. The system rewarded his strength and determination, while remaining willfully blind to the destruction he caused in his personal life. This wasn't mere oversight or bureaucratic inefficiency. It was a system that required villains to justify its own existence, that needed monsters to validate its heroes. Shigaraki represented the inevitable consequence of this moral framework, not a mistake to be corrected, but a feature of the system working exactly as designed. His existence poses an uncomfortable question that cuts to the heart of everything. If hero society creates its own villains through neglect and indifference, what does that say about the heroes themselves? The answer isn't pretty. It suggests that the very foundation of their moral authority is built on quicksand, and that their greatest victories might actually be their most damning failures. The boy who needed saving became the man who could destroy everything, not despite the heroes, but because of them. And in that irony, I see the cruelest truth of all, that sometimes the greatest threat to peace is the very peacekeepers themselves.
今まで30人以上の罪なき人々を殺しました。僕がなぜこのような醜愛な所業をみんなに知ってもらいたい。轟家の長男として生まれました。力に焦がれていました。無理やり妻をめとりました。人を超えられない絶望から霊を持った子を作るため捨てられ忘れられました。なんだか楽しくなってきた。
Part 3. The mirror that shows what we don't see. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Shigaraki's character is how he functions as a dark reflection of heroic ideas. His desire to destroy everything isn't random chaos. It's a methodical deconstruction of a society that he perceives as fundamentally broken. Where heroes preserve the status quo, Shigaraki seeks to tear it down entirely. Where heroes inspire hope, Shigaraki spreads despair. But both approaches stem from the same root, a deep conviction that the current system is inadequate. This dynamic reminds me of the philosophical tension we see in Code Geass, where Lelouch and Suzaku represent two opposing approaches to the same corrupt system. One seeks revolution through destruction, the other reform through working within existing structures. Yet, both are ultimately products of the same broken world that shaped their worldviews. Shigaraki embodies this same tragic duality. He's both victim and perpetrator, created by the very system he now seeks to obliterate. It makes me wonder whether, in his position, I would cling to hope like Suzaku or burn it all down like Lelouch, or perhaps fall somewhere in between. The more we examine Shigaraki's methodology, the more disturbing patterns emerge. He doesn't simply want to watch the world burn for the sake of destruction. Instead, he operates with a twisted sense of purpose that mirrors heroic dedication. He studies society's weaknesses with the same intensity that heroes study villain behavior. He recruits followers who share his vision of systemic change, much like how hero agencies gather like-minded individuals. The League of Villains functions as a dark mirror to hero teams. They have team spirit, shared goals, and even moments of genuine care for one another. This parallel becomes most apparent when examining Shigaraki's relationship with his mentor, All for One. Just as young heroes look up to figures like All Might for guidance and inspiration, Shigaraki found in All for One someone who validated his pain and gave him direction. The crucial difference isn't in the mentorship structure itself, but in what each mentor taught their protege about their place in the world. All Might taught hope and responsibility, All for One taught resentment and destruction. Yet, both were responding to the same societal conditions that created the need for such extreme measures in the first place. Consider how All for One manipulated Shigaraki's trauma, much like how Emperor Palpatine groomed Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars, except with even more calculated cruelty. All for One didn't just exploit an existing villain. He created one from scratch, nurturing Shigaraki's pain and anger until they became his defining characteristics. This raises uncomfortable questions about how society identifies and supports its most vulnerable members. If a villain like All for One could so easily identify and target a traumatized child, what does that say about the support systems that should have protected Tenko Shimura in the first place? The uncomfortable truth is that Shigaraki's critique of hero society isn't entirely wrong. His methods are horrific, but his observations about social inequality, institutional failure, and the way society discards its most vulnerable members hit uncomfortably close to home. He represents what happens when a system's failures are allowed to worsen until they spread into something far more dangerous than the original problems ever were. I find myself reluctantly agreeing with some of his critiques, as I've witnessed firsthand how systems can fail those who need them most, leaving them to spiral into desperation. This perspective becomes even more chilling when we consider how heroes in My Hero Academia often emerge from similar traumatic backgrounds, yet chose different paths. Todoroki survived an abusive household, Bakugo dealt with his own psychological issues, and Midoriya faced years of bullying and social rejection. The difference lies not in the severity of their trauma, but in the presence or absence of positive intervention at crucial moments. Shigaraki's story asks us to consider what might have happened to these heroes if they had encountered all for one instead of all might during their most vulnerable moments. The narrative structure of My Hero Academia deliberately mirrors this theme through its treatment of villain backstories. Each major antagonist receives detailed character development that explains, without excusing, their descent into villainy. Twice's mental illness and social isolation, Toga's inability to express her nature in socially acceptable ways, Spinner's experience with discrimination. These aren't random tragic backstories thrown in for sympathy points. They represent systematic failures that created specific types of villains, each reflecting different ways society can fail its members. In this light, Shigaraki's tragedy was indeed always the point, not as a predetermined fate, but as an inevitable outcome of systemic neglect. His story serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when societies become so obsessed with their symbols of virtue that they lose sight of the conditions that make such symbols necessary in the first place. The real tragedy isn't that Shigaraki became a villain, it's that a society with the power and resources to prevent such tragedies chose instead to react to them after the damage was already done. And honestly, that mirrors far too much of our own world for my comfort. This reactive rather than proactive approach to social problems creates what we might call the villain factory effect. Society inadvertently produces its own enemies by failing to address root causes of suffering and alienation. Heroes become necessary because the system creates villains, but the presence of heroes allows society to avoid examining why villains exist in the first place. It's a perfect closed loop that ensures job security for heroes while guaranteeing a steady supply of new threats to justify their existence. In creating their perfect heroes, they also created the perfect conditions for their antithesis to emerge, ensuring that the cycle of heroism and villainy would continue indefinitely, each generation producing both its greatest champions and its most devastating failures from the same broken system. The mirror Shigaraki holds up to hero society reflects not just what it has become, but what it was always destined to become once it chose symbols over substance, reaction over prevention, and individual heroism over collective responsibility. As I reflect on this, I can't shake the feeling that we're complicit in similar cycles in our own world, where we celebrate heroes without questioning the systems that demand their existence.
Hey, what do you think will happen when the mighty symbol of peace is finally killed by the villains?